Good morning, everyone. My name is Margaret Mwale with the Presbyterian Committee on the Self-Development of People. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm the Associate for Community Development and Constituent Relations for Self-Development of People. And we have several wonderful panelists that we'll be hearing from shortly. However, in the meantime, I would like to welcome you to our panel discussion this morning. Our topic is what lessons around apparent socioeconomic issues can we learn from the three pandemics of 2020, COVID-19, the economic downturn, and civic unrest? And how can those lessons guide us in eradicating poverty in 2021? A quick rundown of the agenda. We will start off with introductions. Then we have opening remarks from Self-Development of People and the Metro Louisville Office for Globalization. As shared in the invitation you received, this event is jointly hosted by these two offices. We'll then move to the panel discussion, have a Q&A, and have some closing remarks. The purpose today is to create an awareness around the intersectionality of the three pandemics experienced in 2020. Again, COVID-19, the economic downturn, and civic unrest. We also want to provide perspectives on each from local and national subject matter experts and explore possible lessons learned to help guide our work in eradicating poverty. To give you some context around where we're coming from with the discussion that we decided to have today. So the scope of the three pandemics and the impact it has had on those living in poverty and also communities of color and immigrants in particular, I think is fairly well understood today. But also these pandemics have severely exacerbated these issues in these communities that were present pre-COVID, i.e. the issues of poverty and also inequities and racism and other issues that are connected to poverty. As you may have seen from the data on the impact of COVID-19 on economically vulnerable communities, communities of color, and immigrants tend to face increased health vulnerabilities. These communities are much more likely to suffer from chronic health conditions. This has made these communities more vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic, and for millions has resulted in job losses. It was against this backdrop that the civic unrest experienced in 2020 also happened. What are some possible takeaways that we hope you will gather from our discussion today? And what lessons can we learn to help guide our efforts to eradicate poverty in 2021? As we enter the first quarter of 2021 and look back, we hope as you listen to our panelists that you will take away new perspectives, new ideas of how we can together engage in our home communities in a way that empowers others to form effective collaborations and partnerships to improve our communities. We hope that you will be encouraged and challenged to look at social and economic justice issues in your home communities. Also look at the past, the present, and reimagine what the future could be and what role you could play specifically. And lastly, we hope to encourage you to be involved in eradicating poverty and its interconnected issues mentioned earlier, such as immigrant issues, race inequities, public health issues, and others in your home communities. A big thank you to the Louisville Metro Office staff, Sabine, Nassim, Amos Izarimana, Will Ford, and SDOP staff, Nina Lewis, who all worked to make this event possible today. And now I'd like to introduce Sabine Nassim, Director of the Louisville Metro Office for Globalization, to you. Sabine?
Thank you, Margaret, and hello, everybody. So I'm Sabine Nassim, and as Margaret mentioned, I'm the Director for the Office for Globalization here for the City of Louisville. Some of you on this call already know that the Office for Globalization was created by Mayor Fisher with the main goals to welcome immigrants into our community and help advance economic, educational, and cultural opportunities that benefit everyone. We provide resources for our immigrant and refugee families so that they can go to school, build a career, or start and run a business. And we strive to connect with immigrant and refugee communities, building a globally welcoming culture and provide equitable access to city and community resources and services. So it is with this understanding that we were able to have the great pleasure to collaborate with Margaret and her team at the Self-Development of People to co-host today's learning opportunity. Together, we quickly realized that both organizations possess this determination to assist underserved and disenfranchised communities and have a strong commitment to keep Louisville a welcoming and compassionate city. And thus, a fruitful partnership blossomed, and I look forward to future collaborative efforts with Margaret and her team. But in the meantime, please allow me the honor and privilege to introduce a Self-Development of People Committee board member from one of our Louisville partner cities, Detroit, Michigan. This is Phyllis J Edwards, who is the Executive Director for Bridging Communities, a nonprofit in Southwest Detroit, Michigan, whose primary focus is elder care case management, development, and rehabbing quality, affordable housing, and neighborhood stabilization. She is responsible for oversight of corporate resources, management of 2 senior independent living facilities, 24 townhomes, and several land contracts, in addition to other asset management and compliances. She is an advocate and supports administration and programmatic changes to current laws and practices that prohibits quality, affordable housing for all, and endeavors to change the current housing practices by influencing legal, regulatory, and legislative policies, and by fostering strong relationships with policymakers by lifting community voices. She serves as a partner with Aging Matters, a day of learning for caregivers and seniors, and is the chair for Aging Services Consortium for Detroit, treasurer for the Southeast Michigan Senior Regional Collaborative, member of the advisory board for the advisory board for the Detroit Area Agency on Aging 1A, board chair for the Community Development Advocates of Detroit, and an advisory board member for First Merchants Bank. Nationally, she is a board member for Presbyterian Committee on Self-Development of People National Committee and the National Association of Nonprofit Organizations and Executives. Phyllis is going to serve as our introductory to introducing those panels and our moderators. So Phyllis, why don't you go ahead and take it forward?
Thank you so much, Sabine. It's indeed a great day in the neighborhood, and I look forward to hearing what this distinguished panel has to say. But before I get started, let's talk a little bit about self-development of people, otherwise known as SDOP. Self-development of people is a ministry that affirms God's concern for humankind. We are comprised of board members from around the country and supporters who are dissatisfied with the past and current state of poverty and oppression. Yet we are united in faith and action through sharing, confronting, and enabling by empowering the people who are economically poor, oppressed, and disadvantaged. People who seek to change their existing structures that repeatedly perpetuate poverty, oppression, and injustice. We can't speak about SDOP without talking about James Foreman, who was active in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, International Black Workers Congress, and the Black Economic Development Conference, which was in Detroit, by the way. A national conference of the same realm grew out of that one, and the Black Manifesto became its platform. That platform asked for $500 million in reparations from white churches and stated that the funding would be used to develop various projects. Foreman presented that Black Manifesto at the 187th Presbyterian General Assembly, and as uncomfortable as it was, they listened. Advocating for conversations regarding reparations and the need of reparations will always be uncomfortable. So we should get used to being uncomfortable until the wrongs are made right. SDOP concept came out of this concern and the idea that it would fund projects in the mode advocated by the Black Manifesto. On September the 29th, 1970, SDOP received a mandate from the General Assembly to use these funds in depressed areas among deprived people. So SDOP has its origin in addressing issues of poverty as well as issues of justice. Today, SDOP remains committed to that same mandate. whereby the self-development of the economically poor, oppressed, and disadvantaged people own, control, and benefit directly from these projects, which in essence promotes long-term change in their lives and in their communities. This unique aspect of SDOP is that its creator understood the importance of not following existing paternalistic models that currently exist, but rather we endorse a model that is developed from the people within these oppressed and disadvantaged communities who have often been marginalized, denied access to economic empowerment. SDOP goals are originated from that Black manifesto, which supports the criteria for funding currently, which mandates a course of action. The groups are diverse, and so are their visions for self-determination and capacity building. Our end goal is to walk with our community partners and for people to have the human dignity, allowing each group to determine their own particular aspect of what economic inclusion should be. As Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So now it is my distinct honor to introduce you to our distinguished panelists today. Let me start with Paula Lamazzi from Sacramento, California. Paula is on the board of directors of Safe Ground Sacramento, Sacramento Homeless Organizing Committee, known as SHOC, and a self-development of people funded project. Paula became involved in the homeless issues when she became homeless. While homeless, she became involved in advocacy, a street newspaper, environmental protection of the American River Parkway, and led community trash pickup efforts with the Sacramento Homeless Organizing Committee. After she got permanent housing, she's continued to stay involved with SHOC and eventually became the executive director. SHOC founded Safe Ground Sacramento in 2009 in response to a city closure of a large tent city. Safe Ground became its own nonprofit, and she continued her involvement as a board member and volunteer staff. Safe Ground mission is to advocate for the decriminalization of homelessness and the establishments of safe ground communities where those who are homeless may reside until they are able to obtain housing. Currently, she is on the board of directors for Western Regional Advocacy Project, Sacramento Loaves and Fishes, Sacramento County Health Center, and co-applicant board, and Mercy Peddlers. Let us welcome Paula. Our next panelist is the Reverend Dr. Alonzo T. Johnson from Louisville, Kentucky. Reverend Dr. Alonzo T. Johnson is the coordinator for the Presbyterian Committee on the Self-Development of People program, a program of the Presbyterian Church. Reverend Johnson has 25 years of experience in urban congregational-based organizing, youth education, creative arts, peacemaking, anti-racism, anti-poverty, anti-violence, and social justice ministries. Reverend Johnson was a pastor at an urban congregation and presbytery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for almost 12 years and has worked as a volunteer chaplain in prison ministry for 9 years. Next, we have Mr. Steve Tabachman. Mr. Tabachman led the creation and growth of Welcoming Economies Global Network, a 10-state regional network of immigrant economic development peer initiatives across the Rust Belt, and co-led the economic integration session at the Obama White House first immigrant integration convening. Steve has authored numerous studies and research reports and is often a featured speaker on the topic of immigrant economic development and has opinion pieces on the topic that appeared in the Washington Post, Politico, and numerous local and national publications. From 2003 to 2008, Steve served as the elected representative for Michigan's 12th State House District in Detroit, home to one of the state's largest immigrant communities, and ended his term as the majority floor leader. During his time in the legislature, Steve focused his work on economic development, but also wrote the Michigan Immigration Clerical Assistance Act to protect immigrants from predatory immigrant service funders, fought for in state tradition tuition equity for undocumented students, and imposed a tax on immigrants' abilities to obtain Michigan driver's license. In addition to his work with Global Detroit, Steve co-directs the Michigan Political Leadership Program at Michigan State University and is a partner at New Solutions Group, LLC. Steve earned his Juris Doctor cum laude from the University of Michigan Law School and a master's in public policy from U of M Ford School of Public Policy. He has taught several semesters at the Ford School as well as Wayne State Law School. He lives in Southwest Detroit with his wife Sharon Dolente and 2 children. Let us welcome Steve. Let us welcome Kendall Boyd from Louisville, Kentucky. Kendall Boyd is the current Chief Equity Officer for Louisville's Metro government. He is responsible for developing and reviewing and implementing equity policies and practices to ensure anti-racism and non-discrimination occurs. He is an attorney who has been director of the Human Relations Commission since 2017 and previously worked as assistant director of human resources for Louisville Metro. Before joining Louisville Metro, Boyd was an assistant Jefferson County attorney. He has also served as a city attorney for Terre Haute, Indiana, and as a deputy prosecutor in Vigo County, Indiana. He oversees the HRC, which monitors contract compliances for entities doing business with Louisville Metro government and enforces all anti-discrimination laws in Louisville's Metro. As equity chief, he is ensuring that policies and practices on matters ranging from hiring and promotion to procurement procedures throughout Louisville Metro align with Mayor Fisher's commitment to improving racial equity in the city. And finally, but certainly not least, let me introduce you to our MC for today, the Reverend Dr. Jermaine Mckinney from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Reverend Dr. Jermaine Mckinney currently serves as pastor of Bethesda Community Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She is an ordained Presbyterian minister of Word and Sacrament, a former moderator of Pittsburgh Presbyterian, and a current co-chair for Pittsburgh Self-Development of People. Reverend Dr. J has served God in many capacities: preacher and revivalist, street and prison evangelist, Christian educator, adjunct instructor, poet, and writer. She is a consultant, a researcher, and presenter with a special interest in urban theology, Christology, and prayer, local mistology, faith-based initiatives, community ministry, and the role of church in the public arena. She is a proud native of Pittsburgh, where she attended public school. Building on a solid and nurturing public school education, she earned a bachelor's degree in business and 3 master level degrees: the Master of Sacred Theology, Master of Sacred Divinity, and Masters of Business Administration, and a doctorate in ministry. Let us welcome our MC for this evening, today, the Reverend Dr. Jermaine Mckinney.
I certainly do thank you for that warm welcome. It is a pleasure to serve with you folks today. I am excited about the fact that we're about to discuss the socioeconomic conditions and the economy and the unrest that has resulted over this past year. So I am looking forward to what the panelists have to say as we discuss the socioeconomic decline due to COVID, the economy, the civic unrest that was experienced last year, and to be able to hear some of the ideas and the things that are going to be discussed that will hopefully lead us into a better future. One of the things I want to do is I want to start with Steve. Steve, there is just so much that has happened. And so I want to pose this question, and I want everyone to begin to think about it because we're going to spend maybe 5 to 7 minutes on each question and try to get everybody to respond. But Steve, what do you think that we have learned about the disparities in the socioeconomic issues from some of the things that have happened last year? Could you start by talking a little bit about the communities that have been, let's say, economically disenfranchised historically, or things that you may have seen that have popped up that are brand new?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. And given I think we're 25 or so folks today, I would certainly encourage people to use the chat box and to shout out questions and those kinds of things, and happy to have my comments interrupted with vocal comments as well, because I think I'm among giants here, and feel like there's a lot of folks who have a lot to say that are going to be equally as thoughtful, if not more so, than anything I can bring to the table. So I think we at Global Detroit, we focus on inclusion of immigrant communities in ways to build a more prosperous region, more vibrant region. We do it in Detroit, which I like to say is America's greatest African-American city, but I'm sure there's some who might contend with that on this call, but certainly a great African-American city, a overwhelming, 80% African-American city. And so that's a unique perspective. I think that this last year has really raised consciousness about inequities, racial inequities, inequities around the foreign-born in our society. Yes, we had a Black Lives Matter movement that started with police brutality, but I think the conversation has, because of the COVID pandemic and the disparities there, we've seen, I think, more attention on these issues than any time before. Just briefly, thinking about some of the statistical evidence, and the first thing I would say around COVID is the health disparities that we know. Based on the CDC, some December 2010 study that they cited, that we're closer to 12% of our national population being Black Americans, yet 34% of the deaths from COVID, almost 3 times the rate in the population, were by non-Hispanic Black Americans. Similarly, according to the American Medical Association, the Latinx community makes up 18% of the population in the United States, but account for 33% of the COVID cases. I don't have the actual percentage of the deaths. And there's they look at multiple areas in geography and saw this to be fairly consistent across different corners of the United States. But what you're seeing is that Black and brown communities, people of color, and foreign-born communities have been ravaged by the coronavirus and the COVID disease in ways completely disproportionate. And I think that is really just a manifestation of the tremendous inequities and history of structural racism that you see in America. So why would it's not a genetic thing. We know that. There's nothing genetically different that suggests that these communities should be ravaged by this disease. It really relates to all the underlying issues and manifestations of structural racism. And I think it's an important, Phyllis, to lead with reparations, right? We have so much to do in addition to reparations, right? That's really just the beginning of the conversation. Because why do we have such COVID prevalence? Well, number one is lack of access to healthcare, right? You don't have primary care doctors. You're not as much a consumer of the medical system. And those are things that are baked into the economic inequities that exist in our country, or frankly, sometimes cultural differences or language differences when we talk about some of our friends in immigrant communities. Secondly, we know that the communities we're talking about are communities where they didn't have the option to not come to work. Economically, there's no safety net to support folks in either working remotely or accessing a social safety net. I'll get a little more into that, but that has been particularly harmful for immigrant communities during this period, indeed because of provisions of the CARES Act that unfortunately, I'm not clear that we are remedying them even with a Biden administration. I will say that the third thing is just the industries people work in. So our home healthcare workers, many in our healthcare, our frontline workers, those in the food service industries, grocery stores, et cetera, these are staffed by these disadvantaged communities, and therefore you saw greater exposure. It also goes to having to use public transit. All of these aspects pile on each other such that you see very clearly the rates 3 times their prevalence in the population in terms of the impacts of COVID. I will add a couple other things just briefly because I want to have more discussion here. Is just that the digital divide is another area in which not just police brutality, not just suffering from COVID, but what we saw is that as we've moved to a remote work environment and as we relied on the internet, Facebook, email, etc., to connect with people, to respond to the disease, to get out important health information, we saw that the fact that we have less digital inclusion, and the realities are that for foreign-born those who speak English with limited ability, they are 4 times as likely as other Americans who have good English skills to have digital access. And there are similar statistics in the Latinx and African American communities.
Thank you.
Okay, and the last thing I just do need to mention is that CARES Act stimulus payments, there were some policies written in there that just excluded immigrant families from accessing any of those supports, and those inequities still exist today.
I want to assure everyone that we have plenty of questions, and I want to try to make sure that I give everybody an opportunity to speak and to weigh in on the issues. And I'm rather curious, Paula, out in California, when we begin to think about how folk are disenfranchised when they're homeless, and the types of communities and the identities, and we talk about systemic racism, but we also need to talk about the systemic treatment of how people those who are disinherited and dispossessed, basically. Can you speak about the disparities and the things that you have seen over the past year that relate to the communities that you serve and the struggles that they're engaged in? Maybe even some of the ethnicities of the communities that you're looking at. And if you folk hear me say amen, that means it's time to wrap it up.
So when the pandemic first started, they closed businesses, even social services were closed and were only accessible by telephone or online, and like coffee shops closed, and the homeless population were totally devastated here, in that they were neglected, they were disregarded. Nobody thought about them for a long time, and it's one of the reasons why Safe Ground has kind of stepped up with some action to create some space for people to live where there's water. So we have a really bad situation in Sacramento where there's no water faucets, and so when everything closed down, that became a dire situation, a dangerous situation, where people were, when outreach workers went out to homeless encampments, the first thing they said is, we need water really bad. And that's just like unheard of, to be without water for most people. And so we started we'll probably get into this maybe a little later about the community's reaction to this. The city didn't really step up really quick, but community groups did, and Safe Ground started a small community to help just some people, but it is as a demonstration to the community about what can be done, and bring attention to the dire situation of those that are homeless.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna go to Kendall. I am saving Dr. Alonzo for last, but Kendall, can you address, just for a moment from your perspective, the issues that you saw in Louisville? I know that you have a unique position as working for equity and making sure that there's no anti-racism, no non-discrimination. But what did you see from your perspective, and particularly related to the communities in Louisville that have been historically struggling with the disenfranchisement and the problems that just exist in the community?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. I was actually sworn into this job on March the 9th of 2020. And the following week, Louisville shut down because of COVID. So my focus on equity had to go towards the COVID response. And then unfortunately, 9 days after I was sworn in, Breonna Taylor was tragically killed in her home by LMPD in the execution of a warrant. So I didn't hit the ground running, I hit the ground sprinting in this work. And to Steve's point, what this pandemic did and the fallout from Breonna's killing did was it exacerbated and highlighted these huge inequities that we have in our community. Louisville is a mid-Southern town. It does have a history of segregation and separation by race. Louisville also is what we call a polite racism town for those of us in the equity circles. We don't necessarily have the Jim Crow signs, but historically there's been a huge racial divide in our city, unfortunately, and that's the work that I'm trying to do to eradicate that. So what I've done is I've looked at these disparities, and we've looked with intentionality at how do we rectify these historical institutional closets of racism? How do we rebrand the systemic racism that has caused this community divide, which has caused these inequities that we see, whether it's COVID related, whether it's poverty related, and really build back a better Louisville. And so one of the things we've done is we've developed this racial equity toolkit that requires a racial equity lens and intentionality at policy making, at budget spending, and just overall government decision making, because Louisville Metro government is in the unique position that we have to address these issues. Louisville Metro government cannot sit idly by while we have various factions in our community warring with one another over the death of an innocent African American woman in her home, right? And so those are key things that we have to address as a city. And so as we get into this work, we have to be very intentional about it, which seems kind of counterintuitive when we look at the history of addressing racism and civil rights in our country. You know, at one point in time, it was see a person for the content of their character, not because of their skin color, right? But history and psychology shows that that's almost impossible to do. We always see people for who they are when we first meet them, but then as we get to know them, we know that they're beyond their skin color. But if we're not very intentional about addressing racial inequity in our community, we're going to continue to see these divides. And so that's what my work is to do here in our community. And I welcome any sort of strategies that other communities have had in addressing racism and inequities in their community so that we can build a better Louisville and a better United States. Thanks.
Oh, you're so welcome. Dr. Alonzo. Doctor, you've heard the responses of the others, and I need you to build on that for one thing. And can you sort of talk about the things that you've heard, because you are you've been in contact with I'm going to say the presbyteries across cities across the country, and folks that have been dealing with these socioeconomic issues of disparities and the struggles. What kind of things have you heard, and what do you want to lift up about some of the things you've heard about the disparities over this past year?
Thank you, Jermaine. Here's what we have learned. We've learned that BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, we learned that our communities, the tragic realities about economic divides, well, it showed us the clear truth. And we already knew that these divides existed, right? Just as was mentioned earlier. But what we saw in this pandemic is the truth about failed policies, the truth about how racism plays an integral role in kind of deconstructing communities. I say that, but then I also say this: what we have learned is that communities are incredibly resourceful too. And that we have, you know, how often do we neglect the voice of the community who has told us time and time again what they need and what is important for them. Our communities had to be resourceful. In our conversation with some of our communities, Jermaine, they were basically like, look, we have to, we rely on ourselves now. We have to rely on our own sense of power. We have to rely on our voice. What we saw with Black Lives Matter movement, we saw the resourceful voice and power of the community. What we also learned is that the world had to listen to the voice of the oppressed. The world had to listen to the voice of those who cried out for Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. We learned that the community is powerful. And we also learned that our communities have been ignored for far too long. We learned, you know, what it's amazing what this pandemic had kind of made us to realize, that we live in triple pandemics of racism and poverty. And I think what this has done, it's also have shown us that we can't do things the way that we used to do them, and that there is a definitive change that is going to need to happen in our society. And so, and what we've learned from this, I think from our communities, is that there is the connective tissue between the virus and social unrest. The concern about communities fighting for their humanity, knowing that we are made more vulnerable. Tack on racism to this. Tack on the lack of access to education to this. Tack on the fact that we have young people in this city that, because they do not have access, you know, they have either have gone to work rather than be in school, or they will miss entire blocks of learning. And so what we are recognizing is that our communities have been ignored for far too long, that our communities have been hurt, and that their voice is really powerful and important. And I think that one of the things that, as we have, as you asked, in talking to churches and talking to other folks, in my conversation with church leaders, folks who are, you know, our churches are engaged in our communities as much as they can be in a time of pandemic, right? But what I've learned from them is the stress, you know, the pain of losing people in the communities to COVID-19, the pain of not being able to bury them in the ways that that the church can do this. I've also heard from our leaders the need for the church's continual attention and listening to our communities. I've heard from our communities themselves that we ought to listen, that we ought to be aware of what types of things are going to need to be in place to make sure that the poor, the people who are struggling, people who are now made totally incredibly vulnerable, we have to listen to what needs to happen. And that, you know, that our models of paternalism, our colonial models are not going to work. We are, you know, we are in a time right now where nothing can be fixed. That lives have been devastated in ways unprecedented. And so, how, as a church, as organizations, as cities, as policymakers, how will we listen to this emerging, powerful and strong voice of the community? And this is not new, right? The community has always spoken through civil rights. And I think now the world is hearing the community. The world is watching and saying, you know, what will we do with those, you know, who struggle? Our community leaders, when I talk to them, they are working overtime. They are trying to make sure that they can, master this technology so that they can do church in ways that are new, in ways that are different, in ways that's going to require a lot of creativity, in a time where there is not a lot of money to be had. So folks are trying to do whatever they can. We are almost in a triage, you know, trying to do whatever we can as we can. One of our communities said to us when we had conversations with them in self-development of people, we were talking to a few of our partners, and they said, we are doing the best we can. And right now, what we're doing is feeding people. This is what we can do. We're feeding people. We're making sure we're gathering food and driving it to communities, because this is all we can do. And this is what we can do right now. And so, you know, this is unprecedented. But at the same time, you know, our communities are continuing to give voice to disenfranchisement. They're continuing to remind us what it is that we need to do to change things, to address things, because our people, our BIPOC communities are disproportionately affected. Think about what's happening to those who are locked up in prisons right now with COVID-19. Think of those who cannot afford bail and are locked up in prisons. In Louisville, we have activists that have been addressing these issues. On top of rallying for Breonna Taylor and rallying for justice, they have also been rallying for justice for those who have been in prison and who are, being exposed to COVID-19, who can't make bail. And so, our communities that are decentralized are taking us by the hand. They're asking us to walk. They're showing us, and they're not waiting. They're letting us know as the church. They're letting us know as communities that this is where justice is. This is where, and they are concerned about the humanity of their fellow community folks. They're concerned about the humanity. They're concerned about the fact that in a time, especially like this, that humanity, the love and care for humanity has somehow been lost. And we're concerned about this. So this is what I'm hearing from our communities, our church communities, our communities that are out there. We're concerned about the continued dehumanization of folks who are made vulnerable. And this is something that we need to address.
Thank you very much, Alonzo. I want to toss a question out to everyone about the implications of the pandemic. And I just want, one of those 30-second, first thing come to your mind kind of answers about the implications of the and its relationship to poverty based on having the pandemic of COVID-19, an economy that has been disrupted, and the very presence or uprising, bubbling up, can't hide it anymore. Issues related to those who have and those who have not, those who are one color and those who are a different color, that have led to some of the civic and civil unrest that has impacted this country in particular, and even down to I'll leave it at that. I don't want to go, and pick on particular cities or individuals, but at least one of the implications. What do you see that's a direct implication of this COVID-19, the economy and the unrest that's happening in America? I'll start with Kendall.
Yeah, I think what I see is when we look at chronic health conditions for communities of color, African Americans, we also see racial trauma playing into that, because as racial trauma impacts a person's health, their ability to fight off COVID, or if they catch COVID, are they going to survive, is really diminished by racial trauma and the chronic conditions that racial trauma causes. I think Steve or someone earlier mentioned access to healthcare and things like that. When you don't have easy access to healthcare, or it's too expensive to go get treated, for whatever medical condition you have, and then somebody brings COVID home or you catch COVID, I mean, that's the real trauma that we're seeing in our communities. And then the heightened stress around what's happening in our communities just really makes it worse. So again, this has really exposed our communities of colors and our community as a whole to these deficiencies and inequities that we see.
Thank you. How about you, Paula? Do you want to weigh in?
Yes, sure. Well, first of all, I forgot to mention that I don't really know the numbers, but there is a high percentage of Black homeless people in our community, and so that's always an issue. And when we had the Black Lives Matter protest, that connection was made really well, and it was it kind of started with mutual aid that was very inspiring. And for people who didn't have food or water, they were being provided at the protests, and people were brought in. But the whole experience, I think, has the COVID has brought this tremendous awareness in our community and probably across the world about disparities and just like the human suffering. And this has led to some great policy changes in Sacramento.
Thank you. Steve, I'm gonna toss a different question at you because I'm looking at the clock also as we go. What lessons can we learn? What lessons can we learn, as we're going through these pandemics of COVID, the economy, and the unrest that might help move us toward eradicating poverty?
I don't know if it's so much lessons, but I just want to impress upon us all that now is the time. As I said, the awareness of racism, of the impacts of racism, it's never been as great as it is now. And we have to seize that momentum. Reparations absolutely should be on the table. And it shouldn't be an uncomfortable, I mean, I know it is an uncomfortable conversation, but it shouldn't be. We got to get to a point where it's not. And I'll just say, kind of combining with it, answer the question before, I certainly feel like we've had tremendous tragedy. That's the experience of the last year. It's just been traumatic. It's been tragedy. I don't want to gloss over that. Don't let any crisis go to waste, that strategy element. I read that the various child tax credit investments of the stimulus plan have the opportunity to eliminate half of child poverty in the United States. That's how much we've invested. And when you think about how staggering that could be, but the reality is we've just never put lots of government money on the table, and we certainly never put it in a way that was designed to get to folks that need it. I'm sure we're going to have a hard time getting the people we serve through all the tax policy work to make sure that they're filing returns and claiming the credits owed to them, et cetera. But there are billions and billions of dollars right now on the table to go to working people. We got to make sure they get it, and we got to keep the ask going. This should just be the beginning.
All right. Alonzo, I have the question that I want you to start us with, and then it's open to anyone after Alonzo gets finished. And if I don't cut it off, because it would be time to open to the participants if they have questions. And by the way, if you have questions for us, now is the time for you to start typing them in, because otherwise I will continue on with my own question. But let me ask you, Alonzo, in terms of working together and helping to eradicate poverty in each of our the cities that are in the country, for that matter, in the world, what kind of non-traditional ways do you imagine that we can begin to work together to help eradicate poverty? And I would really want to hear everyone's thoughts on this. So when Alonzo gets finished, don't leave any dead air, just simply begin to speak.
I think some of the non-traditional ways, there's so many. One, how are we tapping into the arts community to help do this, right? I think this is really important. How are we tapping into, how are we making connections possible? How are the religious communities connecting? Now, we've of course had a history of civil rights and engagement from the church. But I think this is gonna call for some new types of connections. This is gonna have to call for, it's events like this. How do we have conversations across the spectrum of groups that are affected? I think one thing that's gonna be really important is that listening to the voices of those who are directly affected. I think that this thick listening is gonna be powerful. Theologian Paul Tillich says the first lesson of love is listening. Right. And I think that we're going to be needing to listen to those communities that are directly affected. I think that changes the way that we do policy. It's going to change the way that we approach addressing these issues. How do we, as institutions, how do we decolonize the way that we do things and listen and have a more communal approach? I think one of the things that's been powerful about self-development of people is that we recognize that folks in communities have the power of self-determination. What this pandemic did It's set back communities. It's set back the capacity of some of our communities. It's set them back in being able to develop in ways that they need to develop. I think that there's going to be opportunities to do some new and exciting things. I don't even think that I can pinpoint all the new possibilities, but I am seeing that, what is it going to take for us to actually make these connections happen? What types of things, how do we listen to communities and walk alongside them? What kind of policies, what kind of actions are going to need to be done? What kind of, how do we have conversations with those who are struggling and center them and center their concerns? I think that there's not going to be just one way of doing things. I think what this also does is that it's going to open a door for us to be in conversation with community constantly. It's going to open the door for us to always have this kind of larger consortium of people to be in conversation with. That know that we cannot do politics in a vacuum. We cannot do these things in a vacuum. That this is going to be about making connections. One of the things about self-development of people that I think has always been a part of who we are, as Phyllis talked about, our birth being out of concern of reparations. It was really about how do we also create possibilities in addressing economic inequities in an amalgam of different diverse communities. Because of that work, we have been able to connect the church community with the secular community. We have been able to connect different communities of different diverse communities who have not talked before to be in conversation about water rights, to be in conversation about lead, to be in conversation about those kinds of things that have been affecting our communities. And I think that we need a larger conversation with more partners about what is it going to mean to partner, and especially as we talk about resources. Resources is going to be the key. And so how do we have these conversations about resources? What kind of ways for those of us who give grants, how will we change our way of doing this kind of thing to center our communities? Edgar Villanueva, really quickly, in his book, Decolonizing Wealth, talks about this. And how do we create a decolonized model of conversation where people who are directly affected are at the center of this? And that we move away from these colonial models of inviting them, but really listening. And so I think that's going to be important.
Okay, does anyone else want to weigh in on that particular issue? The non-traditional ways we can work.
Oh, yeah. So I just wanted to point out an example of how things are starting to work differently now. With the situation I was talking about, the homeless people being deserted by the community, community members started stepping up, grassroots mutual aid groups, individuals, church groups, just kind of stepped up and just started going out to the encampments, and they started providing porta potties, which wasn't allowed for the homeless community by the city, and the city almost had them removed because that just is not what they did. And after maybe a couple months of this great outpouring of community support, the city and the county finally got on board more. The county was doing some healthcare outreach, but now we have new policies on how to fix the homeless situation that are more compassionate and not punitive. And with this mutual aid and community stepping up, came a new connection between disparate groups. Like we have have formed new coalitions of different issues because even non-homeless organizations were concerned and motivated. That was just one thing, one example.
Okay. I want to remind our audience that this is a Q&A session and that you are more than welcome to send messages in the chat that we might be able to ask our panelists. But I want to go to I'm going to go to Kendall and then I'll come back to Steve. Kendall, what is Louisville doing anything non-traditional out of your office or in other offices with the city that that might make people take notice, or that maybe even things they don't even know that are currently happening that are making a difference or trying to make a difference based on the implications and the impact of what has happened based on the COVID, the economy, and all the unrest that we have?
Yeah, one thing we did, actually, we declared racism a public health crisis in Louisville late last year by executive order of the mayor. Another thing that we've done is the mayor created, again, via executive order, Equity and Procurement Task Force, which is aimed at addressing racial wealth gaps when it comes to minority business utilization and utilizing minority business for capital improvement. For those who are familiar with the Atlanta model of the late 70s, early 80s, Atlanta, with the expansion of its international airport, made specific intentional investments with the utilization of minority firms, which created, Georgia's first sort of Black millionaires. And so based on that model, Louisville wants to, over the next 5 years, we've got roughly $5 to $6 billion in capital spending that's going to occur with Louisville Metro Government, Louisville Water Company, Louisville Gas and Electric. And as part of that spend, we want to utilize, with the lofty goal of 15 to 20% utilization of minority businesses to take part in that spend. That's how you eliminate racial wealth gaps. In addition, the mayor, as part of the National Conference of Mayors, is in serious talks about reparations and also about Kerner 2.0, the Kerner Commission report from the 1960s, about making intentional investments in marginalized communities to, again, eliminate these racial wealth gaps so that people do have access to fair, affordable, quality, fair housing across the community, not just pockets of the community, across the whole community. And so, in that we have these various infrastructures in place that allow people to go see the doctor before they get sick, that allow people to do care for chronic conditions, that allow children to have quality education with respect to like digital divide and things like that. So those are some of the things we're doing in Louisville. Of course, we could always do more, and we're constantly searching for new ways on how we can address inequities in our community.
Very good, very good. Anybody else want to weigh in? Steve, you want to weigh in?
Well, I'll say one small innovative thing we did is because the CARES Act had these really horrible provisions that if anyone in the household wasn't a green card holder or a permanent or a citizen, you couldn't get a stimulus payment, any adult. The city was successful in working with the Open Society Foundation to get a grant. Well, it was really a grant that went to a partner organization, and Global Detroit and 4 other organizations helped distribute a sort of stimulus check for immigrant and undocumented families that didn't have access. I found out yesterday that Washington, D.C. actually appropriated $14 million from local revenues for this kind of purpose. We didn't appropriate any local dollars. These were all grant dollars that the city didn't actually touch. So that's really the only really innovative thing that we've seen that is kind of doing things that with what folks need. I mean, I think the federal government has done a lot, and we've been, but we haven't been in a resource position to kind of do those kinds of investments at our city level.
Let me add, I don't see any questions coming from the audience, but
Actually, Jermaine, we do have a couple of questions in the chat. We have a question from someone who has asked, Eileen has asked, what can a church tangibly do today other than throw money at the situations? They are a largely white church in a semi-rural community with virtually no Black, but many Latinx. So any suggestions from the panelists?
Okay, do we need to have that question repeated? Because unfortunately it does not show up in my particular chat. Or did you guys hear that question, or should we ask to have it repeated?
I'm happy to repeat it.
I heard the question and it's in my chat. It's a question about how churches in a semi-rural community who have some Latinx parishioners but no African-American parishioners, how do they get involved? I'm not really qualified to answer that. I'm not a church.
I do want to answer that. There's several ways you can get involved, and especially depends on one is advocacy, right? I think that again, here's that listening piece. churches are facing communal transformations, right? Communities that no longer were one thing are now that they're changing. And the church is going to have to change. That's the hardest word for churches or any organization to hear. But right now, especially, the change is going to be imminent. So one of the things you can do is, other than throw money at the situations, right? There's a direct action, but then there's also advocacy. Churches, you have a voice to do the actual political advocacy around these issues. I would urge folks to be in conversations with the leadership from the communities in their neighborhoods. So, for example, you have a largely white church here. Are you in conversation with leaders of the Latinx community? Are you in conversation about, what makes community, what's going on, what ways can the church? Now, remember, the church is got an identity, and the identity is part of Jesus. It's about poverty eradication. It's about community building. It's about all these particular types of things that we are trying to figure out exactly what that means for many of our churches. But I think that one of the things is, getting to know your neighbors. Who are the people in your neighborhood, right? What's going on? What are the issues? But also understanding that in those issues, yeah, you can throw money at a problem, but you can also advocate. One of the things that's been powerful for the Presbyterian Church is that we have an Office of Public Witness that is in Washington, D.C., headed by the Reverend Dr. Jimmy Hawkins. And a lot of this is, talking to our leaders who are making decisions, who are making policy. How do we connect with that? And this transcends partisan politics. And I want to be clear about that, because this is not about being conservative or liberal. This is about the politics of Jesus and the politics of humanity. How do we take care of each other? This is not about being on some side, but this is about taking care of those who are hurting. I guarantee, if there's a Latinx community, are they having conversations about immigration? Are they having conversations about employment? Are they having conversations about the very important things that affects the lives of people? Are they having conversations about race? The reality is that, again, our communities are going to be facing some transformations. And the church, and ideally, the church of the Bible, has always told us to be ready. But the problem we've had, because of racism in America, we have not been ready for these transformations. So we don't know what to say. And the only thing I can say to you is to engage. Meet the leaders, be uncomfortable, and go and meet the leaders of those communities. Hey, here's who we are. We are a church, especially as COVID is, as we're at the end of this pandemic, hopefully, and as we begin to meet and start doing things. Think about, this is asset mapping. Think about what you have, the building you have, the things you have, the space, the resources you have to take care of folks. This is more than just throwing money. This is about making relationships. And this is going to be key to this new time.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
If I could, I also wanted to, if you don't mind, Jermaine, wanted to piggyback on what Alonzo just said, especially as related to our Latinx community. And Steve, maybe you could chime in on this too, because you've got a lot of that experience. It's exactly about engaging, right? And in Latinx communities, there is a heavy presence of God and church. That is, they go very, very hand in hand as for their community. And that is where they socialize. That is where they, it is a cultural aspect for their everyday living too. So, I mean, for Eileen, there's absolutely, involving as a church, engaging with that Latinx community, it would be very, very beneficial for them as well.
Okay. Other questions from the audience?
If I could also add to that, this is Kendall in Louisville. Sunday is probably one of the most segregated days in America, right? Even though we're all supposed to be going to worship, under the same auspices of God and Jesus and things like that, we do it in a separate manner, which goes against, in my opinion, the gospel. So I think what's important for churches to do, to Alonzo's point, is community engagement. Like what we did here in Louisville, we had the author of The Color of Law come into a predominantly white church and speak about the history of redlining and why making that right for communities of color is the burden on the people that go to that church. It's not about finger pointing and blaming. It's about, hey, we're going to have this comprehensive discussion, and here's what role that you church members can play in transforming our communities. And so Instead of being segregated on Sunday, why don't we integrate on Sunday, worship together, pray together, and then speak the truth together?
Amen.
Jermaine, this is Phyllis. May I say one thing about on this subject, which is very dear to my heart, is that churches need to open their doors and see the community that is outside the door. A lot of churches now are what I call bedroom churches, right? Where people drive in, they have service, and then they leave. But they have failed to really open the door and see how the community around them has changed. And that's some of the issues that is perpetuating this continued injustice in communities, is because churches that have played such a dominant role in the lives of people for so long have failed to really step up to the plate and recognize the community in which they now exist, and to address those individuals and residents there, and to hear what is going on in their communities. It's business as usual inside the doors, but it's not business as usual outside the doors.
Amen to that. Well, if there are no other questions, I believe I might be a minute or 30 seconds earlier, but I would like to call on Margaret and ask you if you would take us to the end of this program. I want to thank those who have listened in for being present. Hopefully you've learned some things, but I'm going to ask Margaret and Wally if she would tie things up for us and help us to tie back to some of the original takeaways that we hope you would get from this program.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jermaine, for the role, the very important role that you have played as we have listened to our experts this morning. And also a huge thank you to all that's been shared by each of our panelists. So as we think back to the hope for outcomes or takeaways that we talked about earlier, we talked about the fact that we were hoping you would come away with new perspectives or new ideas of how together we can engage in our home communities in a way that empowers others to form collaborative initiatives, to also form coalitions, and thus to help improve our communities. We talked about another hopeful outcome, that you would be encouraged and challenged to look at social and economic justice issues in your home communities. And also look at the past. How is the past influencing the present? But also, how can the future change? We cannot change the past, but the future is ours to reimagine. And based on the conversation that we have had today, how do you think you, our audience, can play a role in that? And also, as one of our hopeful outcomes, we hope that you have been encouraged to be involved in eradicating poverty and its interconnected issues. We heard about many issues that are connected to poverty. We heard about immigration. We heard about health issues, social determinants of health. Those are, for example, minority communities tend to live in areas that are disproportionately impacting them in terms of the environment. And we talked about race inequities, recognizing that each part of the country may have its own unique challenges, although some challenges may be common nationally. But at this point, as we try to absorb everything that we have heard today, I want to go back to our panelists who have done such an excellent job of educating us this morning, challenging us as well, and to ask them whether they can share any available resources or point us to available resources that can help address some of the issues that have been discussed today that will help to bridge gaps in disenfranchised communities. And anyone can respond to that, please. And then I have one more thing that I was hoping will help us tie all this together. So again, could you help our audience understand what might be available resources in the particular city that you're in to help address some of the issues discussed in bridging the gaps in disenfranchised communities? Anyone, please start us off.
I'll start us off by saying, with self-development of people, we in the Presbyterian Church are celebrating the work of self-development of people for 50 years, and we're celebrating this on Sunday. And the resource that I would like you to connect with is our Self-Development of People Sunday resource, which is on, it's on our website. I wish I could pop that in the chat real quick. But, and the reason why I suggest this to you, not only does it give you a sense of the amalgam of communities we work with, but there are particular links in there. We have partnered with our peacemaking program, and there's a commitment guide to peacemaking in there that has a list of resources, films, websites, ways, especially for Eileen, who is wanting to know how the church can tangibly do these kinds of stuff. But this is not just for church people, right? This is also for anybody who is concerned about poverty, concerned about getting involved, educating, exciting, inciting, whatever they like to do to really lift up the issue of poverty. I think that this can help them because it will have in it a bunch of resources. And I hate to just go resource heavy on folks, but I think the power of those resources is the diversity of them. Books, movies, webinars, whatever way that we can make conversations about our engagement in the political process to address these issues on a larger political level, but also the engagement that we can do this on a communal level. And I'm hoping that this resource will be helpful in helping us craft and create discussions and to motivate people to do something about poverty.
Thank you, Alonzo. And I've just typed the SDOP website in the chat. So for those of you that would like to learn more about that, please, you can access it that way. Others, please.
I guess I could start. So locally, we have we formed a new coalition called the Sacramento Services Not Sweeps Coalition. So this is just various groups, labor groups, and homeless service providers. And so it's been a great resource for us to have a coalition that works with different subjects. And another less local one is Western Regional Advocacy Project has a lot of resources for homeless advocacy and, posters and artwork. And it's a great resource if you're wanting to advocate for the unhoused population. And their website is raphome.org. And one of the other groups, one of our big mutual aid groups is SAC Soup. They're on Facebook. Just Sacramento SOUP in big letters, and they're a great group to follow.
Yeah, this is Phyllis. I just want to say that there are certainly great books, as Alonzo said, and videos that people should get and take advantage of. There are a lot of certainly the resources that Paula has talked about. But I found that one of the greatest resources that you can have, there are a number of soup kitchens, homeless shelters, people that are just on the street that you can stop and have a conversation with to get to understand the issues that are impacting them. Sometimes as a practitioner, I'm one of those people who said we don't need another mountain, we don't need this. What we need is enough love in our hearts to actually care about the souls that we see that are struggling on the street, to stop and ask them, what is it that you can do? There are a number of ways in every city across this country that you can get involved. Don't be a stranger to it, because I guarantee you it won't be a stranger to you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you, Paula. Anyone else?
This is Kendall from Louisville Metro. Since I do represent Louisville Metro government, I would encourage anyone who lives in the Louisville Metro area, or even if you don't live in the Louisville Metro area, to go to louisvilleky.gov. That is the official website for Louisville Metro government. We have a ton of resources on there available for anyone who's concerned about issues around poverty, homelessness, racism. Our Center for Health Equity is one of the few that exist in the country. They put out every other year, they put out a health equity report, which examines root causes of health inequities based on race in our community. Everything from education to employment to environmental racism is examined in those reports. So I would encourage everyone to look at that website. Also, my office, the Office of Equity, we have our Racial Equity Toolkit is on that page. If you're interested in learning more about the toolkit, I would invite you to go see that as well. We have Office of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods for Louisville Metro Government, which is focused around violence in the community, mostly with our young people. That's also on the Louisville KOI website. Sabine's Office of Globalization, is a great resource for our immigrant communities. And then again, with the COVID response, we actually have a COVID-19 area on the webpage that tells people how to get tested, how to get the vaccine, and gives you tips on how to stay safe during the pandemic.
Thank you, Kendall. Anyone else?
I'll just briefly, I put a bunch of websites in the chat about how to national and local reach out to immigrant communities. The last one was a new ad council campaign called Belonging Begins With Us. I do think this kind of intersectional work to tie communities that have been experienced sort of structural exclusion is really critical for us to get through a new America. And so just encouraged and really emboldened by all the comments that were made today.
Thank you so much for that.
And I added Poor People's Campaign. We're involved locally pretty heavily, and they have the national group, and it's pretty intersectional. It's a great group.
Thank you, Paula.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. We are too, SDOP and Presbyterian Church. We have been walking alongside the Poor People's Campaign as well. And I would suggest in that to look at Liz Theo Harris's book, Always With Us, who she's part of the Poor People's Campaign, and she's got a great resource about the theological kind of dismantling of poverty, but also talking realistically about how we as communities can do this work.
Thank you all. So before I turn it over to Sabine, who will do the closing for us, I do have, as we're thinking of, okay, we've got all this great information, we've learned some new things, we're looking at things hopefully through some new perspectives that have been shared this morning. But once again, to tie this together, our panelists, we have just a couple of minutes before I hand it over to Sabine. For those in our audience that are out in our communities and they are looking for ideas to spark innovative ways to do their part in healing and unifying our communities that have been so fraught with the issues that we have discussed this morning, what would you say to that person or to that community? What are some innovative ways that they can do their part in healing and unifying our communities, and thus to help continue to improve our communities? And again, this is for anyone. In just a couple of minutes, then we'll hand it over to Sabine.
For me, democracy requires citizenship. You can't expect your democracy/republic to survive if you're not involved. These issues that we've talked about sooner or later will impact your whole community. So follow your passion, follow your heart. If you're disgusted, upset about what you see on TV or what's happening in our world, it's your duty to get involved to make it right. And so that's what I would encourage people to do.
Thank you so much, Kendall. Maybe one more response and then we hand it over to Sabine.
Well, I guess I would say something that's always helped me get out of myself is to share and to connect, to engage.
Thank you. I love that word, engage, which is exactly what we've done this morning. Mm-hmm. And all of you are on this panel for a reason, because you are involved in engaging in your own very specific role in our communities. And so we thank you for the wonderful conversation we've had. We thank our skillful moderator and also everyone, again, that's been part of planning this. Sabine, take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Margaret, and thank you, everybody, panelists, for being here. Attendees, for you, I would say, hopefully this is a start to that conversation. This is to whet your appetite, right? There's so much more conversation that can happen. One huge takeaway I had is engagement. And how do we engage? How do we really want, as community members who are looking for concrete examples, to work with our community partners and our community organizations and our city, like the Office for Equity or our churches or Global Detroit? What do we do? How do we do this? And how do we engage? one, you've seen all of the panelists here. I would encourage you to reach out to them if you have specific questions, if you had recommendations, or would like to see how you can work with them. I know every single one of them would be willing and happy to do that. Another way is, and I put this on here, is the different links to self-development of people. And this is something that Alonzo had shared. And you'll see that there's the Self-Development of People Sunday resource right here, as well as the Facebook, which if we didn't mention this earlier, this session was recorded and it will be available for viewing on Facebook for both Self-Development of People Facebook site, as well as the Office for Globalization Facebook site. So if you had a colleague or a friend that wasn't able to make it today, or you know that this is going to be valuable information for them, I would highly encourage you to share that that link with them for Facebook. In addition to some of the Self-Development of People resources, which we will follow up in an email so that you have that, I'm going to share some of the contact information for myself and for Amos, who is our program manager for the Office for Globalization. And our website as well is there. So again, I encourage you to reach out. Any questions, any concerns, any recommendations, we'd love to hear from you. All right, on that note, I'm going to say thank you for joining us and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.